Hello, I'm Joan. I'm a Canadian family physician who also works as a restorative medical educator, facilitator, and coach. I create spaces that rehumanize the work of healthcare. I'm creating this podcast to remind myself, as well as anyone else working in a helping profession, that when you are working and caring for your human patients, you are the other human in the room. Hello there, healthcare humans. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of The Other Human in the Room. I am super excited for this conversation with this particular guest. Stephanie, you're someone new in my life that I didn't know was a person on this planet a year ago, and I'm so happy to know you now. I'm really excited. Like, one of the things that I love about this podcast is finding people who are not in healthcare at all, but who have interesting ideas and interesting frameworks from like other industries and other parts of the planet, and considering how those could be helpful to healthcare, because I think sometimes healthcare thinks it's going to find its own solutions from the inside, and that's clearly like not working so well. So that's why I thought it would be fun to have you on and talk about the work that you do. So before we dive in, can you introduce yourself to everyone and explain what is this work that you do?
Yeah, and by the way, I love to hear that because I like to take my work into different industries. Like, that's the creative fun for me as well. So my name is Stephanie Ockerman, and I am a trainer, coach, consultant, and kind of my focus is business agility and leadership. I'm a licensed professional Scrum trainer, and I have a feeling we'll talk about what Scrum means at some point. I'm an author and entrepreneur. And I really kind of like focus with all those words like that sound cool and interesting. At the end of the day, it's really about like helping people and teams shift to more like innovative, creative, human-centered ways of frequently delivering value, getting feedback, solving complex problems. And to me, all of that serves an even bigger mission of organizations then being able to actually leverage their power and influence, right, to help us solve the big, impossible seeming problems, and also just create more thriving environments where, you know, people feel seen, they feel like they can do their best work, because to me, that's how we all are going to be able to thrive together.
That sounds so good. So from you, I learned that there's this term, Agile. Mm-hmm. And I knew that word existed before, but that it's like a term and I don't even know, an approach. And also this, how it's connected to this idea of Scrum. Because before that, I think I'd heard of it as a rugby term, but otherwise didn't know it could be like an industry term. So tell me a bit about, like, is there a little basic 101 version that you can share of like what the framework is that you use, this Agile thing and the Scrum thing?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, cool.
So it is interesting that you talk about that word agile, because I will start by saying there is sort of like this agile industry, and it shouldn't be an industry, because that kind of leads to, I would say, like anti-patterns and, trying to monetize things in ways that are not necessarily actually aligned with what agility was really about. So to set the stage, agility itself is really just about taking a different approach to work when the work is complex, creative, when we are working in environments that are uncertain, that have a lot of unknowns, that are likely to change as we're working. And so the idea is we want to take an approach that fits the type of work that we're doing and the type of environments we're working in. And it did start in the software world, because there was this recognition. And there had been a lot of times where, like, a lot of years of trying to take like industrial ways of working and apply that to software development, and sort of treating people like, you know, machines, and treating like software development like, you know, doing factory work. And it doesn't really work. And the reason we knew it didn't work is what was happening is like it would take forever to deliver, right? These really complex things. And then, by the time we deliver, the need changed. Or we didn't really understand the need to begin with because we didn't actually collaborate, and so like there were all these problems, but there were these other people kind of doing things differently. And they got together and wrote what is known as the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. It was something people had been doing for a while, but I think it was officially published in like 2000, something like that. And it's all it is a set of values and principles. And so I'll hear a lot of times like, we do an agile methodology. And I'm like, I hope not. Because it's meant to be a set of values and principles. And then we might design frameworks, we might design processes, and utilize techniques and practices, but it's all about, is it in alignment with the values and principles, right? But the values and principles, before I even get into that, it's about the why behind them, right? And so when we are working in a more agile way, the way we will know that we're doing that and we're getting the benefits of it is, are we getting a return on our investments earlier? Right? Are we actually able to get value out the door sooner? Are we able to validate our assumptions sooner, which ultimately means less waste, less risk, right? That we're not carrying these like investments. We don't have a project that goes for a year and a half and then we deliver it and find out it totally missed the mark, right? Or a competitor beat us to it, or right, like there's a bunch of reasons that can happen. But at the end of the day, like, are we able to deliver and get a return on our investments sooner? Are we able to manage the risk of our investments? And are we able to more easily respond to change, to either to take advantage of opportunities or to respond to risks that are happening? So, you know, I always like to start with like the business case for it, as like, you know, I'm using financial terms for a reason to point out that like this is still about, you know, value and the cost and the risks associated with delivering value. And so that's what I always come back to is like, are we getting the benefits? Are we getting enough of the benefits? Okay, what do we need to tweak? And now to give you a sense of like the values and principles, right? So there's a set of like 4 values. That is what the Agile Manifesto is. And it's things like, we value working software over comprehensive documentation. And so instead of writing up all the requirements documents and having all of these plans and designs and all the meeting minutes documented and all of that, it's saying, hey, look, there's more value in seeing something tangible of value that actually provides somebody value. Right?
Yes.
So it's not to say we don't care about documentation and that it never has a purpose. It does. But the point is, we value working product over just comprehensive documentation. Right? The other one that I really like to talk about is that we value responding to change over following a plan. And so this idea of, I like to talk about it as, we treat planning as an activity, not a document. Right. And so what you'll see, like, I come from a more traditional project management background in my career where I started, is like, you get these huge Gantt charts and, you know, like really big comprehensive documentation about how we're going to run this project. And we get really attached to that because we spent a lot of time on it. And then we spend a lot of time updating it as things change. And it's like, is that helping us be responsive to change, or are we now actually incentivizing ourselves to not respond to change?
Yes.
And then the other one is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So it's not to say we don't have processes and tools, but it's to say we value individuals and interactions more. And so I interpret that as, our processes and tools need to center our ability to collaborate and have meaningful communication. And the fourth one is this idea of customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And so what we mean by that is, you know, instead of, hey, we wrote up at the very beginning of this initiative every single thing this product would do or this new service we're rolling out would do, now that disincentivizes us to work with our customers and understand that, oh, actually what we thought isn't really what we meant. And, oh, the need change. So this idea that we should be collaborating with our customers versus treating it as like this contract where we're trying to like win or lose. Right? There's a lot of like interesting things that happen in business when you get into that. So it's really that set of 4 values. And again, we don't value the things on the right side of that equation. It's just saying we value the things on the left more. And then there's a set of 12 underlying principles. I'm not going to like go over them all, but it's things like teams and stakeholders need to work in ways that are sustainable, right? So this idea of sustainability is important. This idea of building building projects around like motivated individuals, giving teams the tools they need to do their job, right? So this idea of self-managing teams is really important in the work that I do as well, versus somebody like feeding directives down from outside the team. It's like, hey, wait, these are the experts. These are the ones who have the knowledge and the skills. So what do we need to do to enable them, and trust that they are the ones best to do it? And you know, the principles and the values often, in my experience, get forgotten along the way, and we lean into the practice, the tool, the framework, but we still sometimes bring in the old ways of thinking into how we're leveraging it. And one of the ways I distinguish that is it's this idea of are we working in kind of that older traditional way is plan driven and predictive, right? We're trying to plan it all up front. We think we can predict everything up front, right? Versus are we working in a value-driven, empirical way, right? Where we're letting the value drive us, not the plan drive us.
Oh my gosh. I already have like a million thoughts about this. Because like, you know, maybe, I don't know, if everyone listening, do you have thoughts about this or not? Are you like, what? This is about software? But the thing is, like, well, especially like what you said a little while ago, how... So it makes sense that a place like software could be a place where new, and probably actually not new, but like remembering even like ancient or older ways of like how you actually collaborate together towards a common goal, you know, that software, because it's so like, it's a new frontier and you can kind of reinvent the rules about it, that it's a place where now there's like specific language. It's like versus healthcare, like healthcare for sure is still in an industrial way, which is very odd because it's people, but like you think about how people are moved through healthcare, it is very assembly line, and it's you can tell how, you know, when people figured out factories and they're like, ooh, we can moderize healthcare, and like now this is like how hospitals we move through it, change. Like when you described environments that Agile is helpful in, like healthcare is always going to be complex, and right now it's changing in multiple ways, like faster than ever. Certainly the pandemic absolutely uprooted healthcare, and yet I'm noticing like as the dust is settling on the like early very disruptive years of the pandemic, like that the default is sort of back to old ways instead of innovating new ways. And so I just think it's so interesting to like interpret each of those principles and how they very, very much could apply to healthcare, especially like, do we need to always do the same thing again and again? Do we need to have a full plan and know exactly what's going to happen to move forward? Like, I think a lot of us who go into healthcare, we're craving more certainty, which is tough because we've chosen a profession in which we have to embrace uncertainty. And so,
and I would assume always be innovating as well.
You would assume,
right?
It's interesting. I had another conversation with someone who, she's also from the business world, but she talks to people in healthcare and she calls herself like a futurist.
I listened to that one.
Yes, I thought that. I'm so glad you did. And so how she was saying how so the way we do little change work is usually called like quality improvement, and it's still about applying an external framework and are we doing it well enough versus having, I bet what she was talking about was in some ways agile principles, like innovate is like, are we centering some value? Are we centering the experts and trying something new because we know we need something new? It's so cool. I think when people think that that's like, I don't know, anarchy or something, but literally it's another approach. It's legitimate.
Well, and what I also think about is like, I think healthcare, science, empiricism, right? Like so it should be like ingrained in our DNA, this idea. I talk about empiricism all day, every day, right? I'm like always reminding people, it's like, look, this is the scientific method essentially. It's like we form a hypothesis, we run a short experiment that's, low enough cost, low enough risk, and, we see what happens, and then we look at the data, we decide what to do next, right? It's like, and then iterate, right? Inspect and adapt. Yes. But what's interesting about it is it all seems very logical and it makes sense, but somehow we're so programmed, right, around like, and there is an internal programming to it of like, as humans, we like certainty. Like there is a part like that, there's a biological aspect of that too. But there is also, I think we've been immersed in systems, and I imagine it's all the schooling you get to in healthcare to become like you're still going through these industrial education systems. Same thing with like how, I went through school and getting a business degree and then going out into the corporate world, right? Where it's like, this is how we do things. Like it is just naturally, we need to know right answers. We have to get it right, and like, even in the Agile world where I work, it's like, we talk about these things of like, we want to fail fast. Failure is learning. And yet if you actually slow it down and ask people like questions, you start to realize there's a fear of not getting it right? Yeah. Of like, well, we forecasted this date but we have to hit it. And I'm like, but all estimates are wrong. Otherwise it wouldn't be an estimate. So
that's a good one.
And like, there's a reason we're using the word forecast instead of a promise. And language does matter, I think, but we still also hold like all of these assumptions as well within us around like, but what if we miss that date, or what, what is my boss going to think? And, but we can't fail. And it's like, but the whole point of this is supposed to be that we work in a way that we can manage that change and the learning and the iteration. Are you frozen or am I frozen?
Okay.
Hi.
My internet likes to just every so often go like this, and then it comes back. And then it's always when I'm halfway through booting up my stupid hotspot that I pay for. So I'm like, deep breaths. I can be agile about my stupidness.
I'll tell you what, the thing that has shown me my own issues where I still like get upset about not having control or like not having things go perfectly is teaching live virtual classes. Because it's like, I can't control the internet.
Yes,
like,
we can't.
I can do everything in my power. I have dual Wi-Fi with like a router set up for it to fail over. I have a UPS in case, there's a power flicker, because that'll take your Wi-Fi down. So I'm like, I can do all the things.
Yeah.
And things can still go wrong.
That's very validating, actually. Thank you.
And so like, it's really helped me let go of some of my own perfectionism around like, I need the class to like, I'm
probably going to leave all of this in because that actually was a very helpful learning point for me that I need to remember for the future. I did want to hear, like, I heard you say, like, you said something that hooked me, and then that's when it cut out.
Okay. Okay, what was it? So you were talking about I think you were talking about goals, like, how we measure like success. Were you talking about that?
I don't think so.
Like, what were we talking about?
I was talking about how healthcare is definitely industrial. We have a ton of trouble with uncertainty. Those are two things for sure. I don't know. It's okay. Well, if we keep talking, then something else will hook you.
Something will come up.
Yeah.
Oh, there is something that you were talking about earlier around, like, this is about software, but it can apply in healthcare.
Yeah.
And I have taught classes for, like, some of my favorite classes to teach are in the non-software space because a lot of that is where you get to be more creative, because not that every software situation looks the same. Like, there's certainly, like, everybody's context is different, but there's patterns, right? Like, there's patterns to it. And when it comes to, like, working outside the software space, that's where you get more creative. And it's like, and so for me, that's fun, like helping guide people toward, like, they know their context, but what I do is I guide them towards how they can start to think about their work in smaller slices of value, like how they can hone in on like customer outcomes and think about how they're measuring value and think about, well, you say you have to do this whole big thing, but what would be like a small slice of that you could deliver in a shorter time? And maybe it's not like it wouldn't make sense to like fully roll it out yet, but you can maybe start testing your hypotheses. You can start getting feedback. You can prove to yourself, hey, we did this and it took this long, and now that gives us a better sense of what this next slice of value will look like, right? So this idea of having empirical data that guides us and proving to ourselves that we can do the thing, that we know how to build it, and that we built the thing, that we built the right thing, right? So like I change my language of how I talk about agility depending on the client I'm talking to. But it always comes down to like, let's start with understanding, how does value get to your customers? Yeah. What are different types of value you deliver? And starting to really define like, you know, what is the value that we create, and at what point in our process do we often maybe get surprised and find out that we have rework to do, or that what we built doesn't meet the need, or that there's quality issues that also cause rework and we have to go back and clean up, right? So it's this idea of like, you can like efficiency to some degree is a part of, you know, looking at process improvement. I just always say we value effectiveness over efficiency.
Yeah, totally.
But this idea of like, yeah, if we have spots in our process where, you know, okay, we're trying to ship, you know, like a batch of something and it's taking 12 weeks, like to go through like all the quality control and like all the people that are involved in being able to ship this thing. And that thing doesn't have to be software, right? Like it could be maybe a medical product, something like that. I've definitely taught classes at, you know, companies in the medical industry. And so this idea of like looking at our process and thinking about, how do we get to value sooner? Like, where do we have waste in the process? Like, where do we have bottlenecks where maybe it's like scarce knowledge, scarce skills? And then also asking ourselves, where do we discover that, oh, now it has to go back here because we found out this was wrong, so it's going backwards in our process. And a lot of that happens because we silo the work to experts versus like, and I'm not saying every type of work like always has to work this way. To me, it's never that like all or nothing, but it's like, where in our process does it make sense to have maybe a cross-functional team, and where does it make sense to kind of work in different ways to avoid some of the waste that we're experiencing, which at the end of the day affects our ability to deliver value, whether it's the amount it costs us more, so therefore we're able to do less for customer value, or it just takes longer to get out the door, which means we're not learning as quickly as we could be, and we're delaying getting value to our customers.
I think, so one ongoing dilemma in my corner of healthcare that I think would be interesting to describe and just have you tell me like how you would approach it. So I'm a family physician, and I don't do hospital work. I see patients in a clinic. And, you know, I have a panel of patients, and the model of how it works is they can, you know, call anytime or book online as well. And then, you know, I see them in some amount of time. And that's like the main, you could say, product, if you will, is like seeing patients. That is the main way I'm paid, though I'm in a model where it's not the only way I'm paid. I'm also paid just for like overseeing their panel. A lot of physicians are paid only when they see patients and like actually have a real-time conversation with them, which is an interesting thing that incentivizes, well, you listen to the
outputs
future.
Over outcomes.
Yes.
Yes.
Like, yeah. And that's a current constraint of many people in the system. And so a common dilemma and stress point is that patients are calling and there's not enough spots for them to be seen. And I'm just curious of like how, if you're coming to it from your perspective, you would like, what questions would you ask, or like how would you apply the Agile principles to that kind of dilemma? Knowing, so we're not shipping, like I guess the thing we're shipping is seeing patients, and there's constraints around that. Like, it causes a ton of stress, and everyone then internalizes it and like really burns out because of it. And it's like, when you think, like, if you took that away, like, it's literally like a kind of a complex math problem of like so much demand and certain kinds of things and so much supply, and like what can be innovated, right? So how would you start to approach such a problem?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of different approaches that likely need to be taken. Like, I think one, there is a systemic side of like root cause, getting to some more of the root causes. And my guess is that a decent number of those root causes are less in your control.
Yes.
They're systemic. So
Very
like, I do
much.
think it is important to understand that and start looking at that, versus just ignoring it and be like, we can't change the system, right? It's like, well, then nothing will ever change if we don't think about it and get smart and like tiny little experiments, or like, I'm also a fan of like not asking for permission, or like in ways
same.
that's possible, stuff like that. So I don't think you want to ignore the systemic side. I think you can do a lot around root cause analysis and starting to like kind of visually map, like, okay, well, this is impacting, and then you start to see like, oh, this one thing, this one policy is having all of these impacts, right?
Yeah.
So I would want to look at that, and I would do that very visually. I would do that with a cross-functional group of people who have different perspectives and expertise. Now, the part that's like maybe more within your control, one thing I might look at is I might start to ask questions that are really in my lingo. It's like, let's define what are the different products that you provide, or like services, like, so every appointment isn't the same, right? So might start to break down like, okay, well, what are all of the different ways in which you provide value through these appointments? And then starting to recognize like, okay, what type of user is that? Like, let's understand that different types of users have different needs, even for the same service. And so really starting to do more of like a user analysis and value proposition analysis, just to start to see like, are there different ways we can deliver value for different types of customers or types of value, that maybe free up some time, or just meet the need better? Because I would imagine there's some things that people prefer not to have an appointment for, if they really don't need to have a live appointment for. So that would be the other direction I would take as well, is like really honing in on understanding value, the different ways that we deliver value to different types of people, because that is where you start to see innovation opportunities of like, well, this group of people, you know, they are gonna, you know, maybe need to come in, like, and we need to prioritize that. But then we can free up more space if this other group of people who needs this other type of value can get that value in different ways. And you might even make them happier than the way they're getting it today. So I think both of those approaches are things I would be looking at. And the good news is some of that is in your control. And you can start to run little experiments around it. I like that you were using that terminology earlier, because it's really like everything we're doing. If we start to think of it as an experiment, then like all experiments don't succeed. So it's like the point of the experiment is to learn. The experiment was successful if we learned. And so you do have to be smart about how you set up your experiment, to like be mindful of like, okay, what are we going to measure? Like what are we assuming, you know, and like, you know, you have to like maybe run experiments for a period of time and think about, well, how much time do we need to like really have enough data to be able to draw conclusions that are useful and things like that.
Oh, I think that's so, I love thinking about it, because I think what I often see happening, like even in my own group or just like generally, is like people are trying to find the one schedule solution, is if you rearrange the appointments or have more or less of them. First of all, that means sometimes we're making a huge shift. Like suddenly now we have to retrain our receptionist on a whole new scheduling system and hope that will fix everything. But there's something about if you break it down by like, so what's a small, like a micro group of people. And my suggestion, I don't know if it'd be yours, but my suggestion is the group that is like causing you the most like emotional grief and angst already. So you're motivated to be like, it can't get worse than this, right? And then it's like, well, what's another way that, care could be offered to these people? What, like, another way that's quicker, that involves other people instead of just me? Or I've wondered about group appointments. That's one that I haven't, like, pulled the trigger on yet, but I actually have some ideas. Like, is there, yes. And when you don't have to think about fixing the whole system. You're just thinking about trying out an approach for one specific part. It becomes possible, because that's the thing when everything's so complex. You're like, I don't know, like your brain just shuts down, and then you like go into a turtle, and then you keep doing the same thing that you know isn't working. And that's what I mostly see.
Yeah, and I mean, that's so important. It's this idea of like, I don't know, we can say it in a number of ways, like not trying to boil the ocean, like it doesn't have, we don't have to solve the bigger problems. It's like, where's the place that I can learn enough, right? Where one, I have enough control to run an experiment, I can learn enough, and then, I might not even know exactly what the end thing looks like. No. But it's like, how do I run an experiment in a way that's going to give me enough data to start to then think about what could be a solution? Yeah. And I think there's a lot of different like assumptions we make about people's experiences and like what they need. And we don't necessarily like really go through the effort of really understanding what is the pain that they're having with the way things are today. What are they trying to gain through this interaction, through our service that we're providing? And like really thinking about, we use the term personas a lot in like the product development world of like, what are your user personas? And so like, that's a concept that I think that might be useful in healthcare as well, because you probably have some patterns that form around different personas. And, it could be based on a lot of different demographics. It could be, like where they live. It could be, how their family situation. It could be age related. It could be, the type of work they do. Right. So it could be a lot of different things. And that just gives what I think it does is it helps you break it down smaller. Yes. You can start to think in smaller slices of value, and then you can start to get into action around it because it doesn't feel so big. And also, like, to your point, it's not that risky. And like, I also think that emotions are data to some degree. So like, if people are unhappy, whether it's the customers are unhappy or the service providers are unhappy, that has an impact on value. That has a negative impact on value and your ability to continue to deliver value in the future, especially if you're talking about the providers of the service. And so to me, like, that makes a lot of sense to start with like what's already the most frustrating, stressful thing, because like, one, it is probably lower risk, but also that is taking a bigger toll on you, right? It's not just about time, right? It's about like, this is the thing that sucks my energy for the whole day, or the thing that keeps me up at night. Oh, exactly. I think that's actually a really good point to make of like what might help you think about where to start first.
Well, thank you. I feel validated in my approach. I think a little bit what this conversation is like, I think I do some of these things, and now I understand the language behind them, and that's very fun. And I love boil the whole ocean. That's like a good, like, let's not try. The thing I hear a lot in like healthcare, committees is like, we're gonna have to build the plane while we're flying it, which isn't good or bad, but like, I think that's a thing that people say it to try and ease the tension of the fact that we don't know where we're going. But actually, have you ever heard of that? And what do you think about that analogy? Because I think it's sort of interesting.
It is interesting. I mean, I've definitely heard the analogy, and I'm kind of like, what do I think about that? So like, I would actually, what I want to know is, where did that analogy originate? Like, what was the original intention of it? Yeah. Because I really don't know. Like, I understand, like, sort of conceptually the idea of, but I'm like, that also doesn't sound safe. Like, I'm just gonna say.
Yes, that also doesn't sound safe. You're like, great, so anything. I'm like flapping my wings, like we're in the air.
Right, like I'm like cycling my feet on, like, am I like riding a bike to keep the plane going? Like, what's happening?
It's not a good one, is it?
So I think there's, so I think if your intent around it is to like help people get more comfortable with experimentation,
Yeah.
and not having the full end solution in mind.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we need a different metaphor, different analogy, because I don't think that one's great.
No.
It's
Do you
terrifying.
have any?
I don't, like, I'm gonna say something and you tell me if it resonates.
Yeah.
And you've heard me say this one before. Like, we got to learn to ride the waves.
Yes. I actually love your surfing metaphor, so please.
Yeah. So like, it's the idea that like, when you learn to surf, like, you're not gonna know how to catch waves like right away. Like, you're gonna wipe out a lot. But the thing is, you just keep going. You keep paddling out. You keep trying something. You have a coach. Like, you are going to learn through failure. You will not learn to surf through succeeding.
Yes.
Like it's just pretty much impossible. And part of the reason I like the surfing metaphors is also the ocean is always changing. You're going to have to change your approach. You're going to have to change where you take off from the wave. You're going to change your paddle speed. Some days you're going to be like, I'm not paddling out today because that is not safe for me, right? So like, I think we need to be more aware of, we cannot control this ocean. We can sense and we can respond and we can practice and we can tweak and like sense and respond, practice, sense and respond. So like, to me, that's more what it feels like, this idea of, I'm just going to go out surfing and like see if I can catch some waves and what I can learn and how I can like grow my intuitive knowledge and wisdom that's going to help me the next time I go out and surf.
Yes.
So I think that's one of the things that I think is a little more helpful maybe, is like, y'all, we're out here trying to catch waves. Like, nobody's out here catching every wave.
Yes.
And like, you're not going to catch the waves if you're freaked out about, I have to catch this wave.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, I think that surfing, like when I think about as I'm going through each of my like patient encounters, like very much I can think of the analogy of surfing as a really helpful one, because, you know, in like each patient sort of an approach, and you know, you attempt to make that connection and see if you can have that satisfying encounter and see if you can move them further along in some way or another, and sometimes you just eat it and sometimes, and then you go on to the next though. Like, I think it's actually a fabulous analogy. And I think what really fails, the other thing about the airplane one that fails is like the notion that there's going to be an end point where there's an airplane and then you're done.
Yeah, then you're done. Yeah, it doesn't make sense either.
No.
Yeah.
And a lot of, like, having done some sort of system transformation, whatever words they use, like committee work, it's like we're always making a plan. And I think it's very interesting what you're saying, where it's like, what was your... Okay,
documentation.
Yeah. And what was the alternative to plans?
So we would say it as like working product or service delivered over comprehensive documentation.
Yeah.
So it's like, I understand what you're talking about. It's like this idea of like, we're going to form a working group, like, and for 5 months they're going to talk about it, and they're going to create a plan. And the reality is that plan is based on a whole bunch of assumptions. And I'm not saying it's not, you know, analysis. Sure, do analysis, but analysis only takes you so far. Right? It's like, at some point we got to start validating our assumptions. And we've just been so like ingrained to like have to have the plan that we can then follow. And it's like, but that it doesn't work that way when we're dealing with complexity, when we need to be responsive to change, when we don't know what the end solution looks like. Right? And you're not going to get to the best end solution if all you do is sit around and talk about it.
Stephanie.
You got to start trying things and get your way there, right? So it's like, I would almost equate it to like, I sit on the beach and I like practice my pop-up every day, and then I go out and I practice paddling, but I never actually like go try to catch a wave. Right? Totally. I just made that one up, but I think it works. But yeah, like it's very interesting to me. And I think a lot of it is fear driven. I think a lot of it's fear driven around like needing to get it right. What if it's not right? And like, I think there's also something about this idea of just like overwhelm,
Yes.
right? So it's like when people are overwhelmed, it is actually hard to truly tap in to your creativity.
Yes.
And it's hard to have the space needed for innovation, and especially when we're talking collaborative teamwork, right? So my assumption is a lot of the bigger problems that we're trying to solve in the industry, they're going to require like a group of people with a range of knowledge and skills to have time to get together, to have time to ideate, to go through like divergence and convergence and like go through the process that it takes. And I think there's also this belief that like, and it kind of comes back to what you were talking about, is like the scheduling tool is going to fix it. And it's like, no, like I can't be creative and collaborative in a 30-minute increment twice a week. Like,
yes.
Like, and I see this in my industry and all the other industries that I work in as well. It's you're not alone. It's like, okay, we're going to form a group. And so like, I taught a class somewhere once, and then they came back and were like, oh, we'd love to have you teach another class to more people. And I was like, great. We're talking Scrum. And Scrum, by the way, it does come from the game of rugby. It was named for that because it's this idea of the team, like swarming the ball as a team, making choices on the field as they're in motion. It's not like somebody from the sideline telling them what to do, right? It's this idea of a self-managing team. They have a goal that they're moving towards, right? And they're figuring out the tactics on the field to get there together, right? So those are like core things you need. You need a common goal that you're moving towards, and they have to have the knowledge and skills and like the trust that they get to make those decisions. And so I taught this class, I teach another class, like, I don't know, a year later. And then I realized from talking to people that the way they were leveraging Scrum is that these people all had they had a responsibility. They had like a job. That was their job. And they were having a Scrum team where they met once a week for an hour to work on a special project. I'm like, I don't know what you're getting done once a week in an hour.
Okay,
because
in healthcare, it's an hour to an hour and a half once a month. I'm not even kidding.
Yeah.
That's how much time we spend thinking about new things. Is that not enough?
And it's like, and if you think about it, it's like, well, what progress have we made? Like, I don't know, maybe you are making progress. Like, I'm not going to say it's impossible.
Right.
But it's that whole, like, when, like, think about, like, okay, now I have to switch context to get back into wherever we left off last meeting.
Catch up.
Right. And then, can we really do the type of thing? Like, collaboration takes time, like, it's not just sitting in a room talking to each other, right? Like as a facilitator, right? Like there's a lot that goes in, that's like a whole profession in and of itself to help facilitate collaborative teamwork, right? Wow. And so, that's kind of there's a limitation there. Yeah. And, I see it, and it's like, if we want things to be different, we got to do something different.
So what does it look like either in theory or when you've seen it in practice, where so the Scrum, it's people from across the organization and they're working on a common goal. And so in practice, is it that they're like literally, I guess, slacking or whatever, texting each other all day, or are they like constantly with each other, or like what does it look like as a facilitator? Like how are you seeing the process look different than the meeting static way that you were describing doesn't work as well, which I resonate with strongly.
Yeah. So just to put a little more context then around like what Scrum is. So it's a framework that all it is a framework, not a methodology, that is basically leveraging empiricism, right? Okay. So it's basically, we have inspect and adapt feedback loop. So it's like we have a self-organizing team that has somebody who we call a product owner, that is the person who is accountable for maximizing value. And I like to say that as always making sure we're working on the next right thing, right? So pointing towards value. Then we have a group of developers who are like the people who have the knowledge and skills to deliver the value. Yeah. right? And that's whatever skills, knowledge you need. Then we have this role called a Scrum Master that is like the person who's sort of like the care and feeding of the empirical process and teamwork. And so the idea is we call it a sprint, and we say every sprint, right, we're delivering an increment of value, something usable, useful, and it has to meet a baseline of quality, right? So that's going to look different depending on what the type of value is that you're delivering. And so we talk about like you want to form a Scrum team around a clear understanding of what is our product, right? Now your product could be we're improving how this hospital runs. We are solving this systemic problem in our industry. Like, I mean, it could be anything, right? Like, but you want to be clear around what is the thing we're organizing around. And there's no rules around this. Like, there's nothing that says like a Scrum team can only be successful if everybody's 100% allocated to that product or service. But what I will say is that the more you split people's allocation to other things, right, you introduce the challenges of context switching. You introduce the challenges of bottlenecks, like in the process and gaps and things like that. So to me, like if you're, and I'm not to say there isn't some work that can be done asynchronously. Perhaps that's true. But again, like that team needs to figure out like, what do we need? Minimally, right? And like, so some of that might be them defining kind of their own working agreements around like, how much work do we set aside to do asynchronously? Like, how much time do I do? What is the best type of work to do asynchronously versus the best type of work where we should really get together in a room or we should pair with somebody, right? So I think there's, if you were to ask another trainer about this, they'd be like, well, it should be at least this much. And I'm like, I think it depends on the context. But to me, it's the questions that you ask that team that are thinking about how they best can deliver value. And so when I've seen Scrum used in sort of like what I'll call non-traditional ways, it's like kind of similar to what you said, where like maybe we're an organization and we're taking people from around different departments because we need to make sure that we're solving problems, right? Like solving the bigger problems that exist. And so those people aren't going to be full-time, right, on that team. They're not even probably going to be 50% on that team, but they need to like get clear on what are they trying to achieve? How are they going to work in short cycles where they can still deliver something frequently? And in Scrum, we say minimally a month. That's like the longest a sprint should be, because if you think about it, once you start going beyond a month, it's like impossible to plan. It's, it's like you're not getting feedback frequently enough to be meaningful. You're not learning quickly. And so I've seen it in that context. I've also seen it where just like everybody says we're doing Scrum, like we're all part of like a Scrum team. And yes, we have individual responsibilities that happen throughout our day, but we never lose sight of the fact that we have this goal as a team that we're moving towards this week, and we still get together. So like in Scrum, we have these events, and the reason we call them events and not meetings is because they shouldn't feel like a meeting.
I love non-meeting
right? So like
meetings.
There's always a very intentional purpose, and it's always designed around inspection, adaptation. So it's like you start with sprint planning. Every day we have what we call a daily Scrum, maximum 15-minute collaborative planning session. What progress have we made toward our sprint goal, right? What have we learned in the last 24 hours that is important for us, to know and share as a group? What's going to prevent us from meeting our sprint goal? Okay, let's get back to work, right? And it doesn't mean you can't collaborate at other times, but it's like minimally we're saying as a team, we need to get together daily, 15-minute max, just to make sure we know where we're at moving towards this goal. And it can be helpful, I think, especially in kind of like service type of organizations where there is like, I'm doing all of these services too. To not lose sight of the bigger things we're trying to achieve. And when we do, and then at the end, we have what we call a sprint review, where we're kind of like taking stock of like, okay, here's the value we created this week. Here's what we've learned from that. And we might bring in other stakeholders, to share that knowledge, get feedback as well. And then we end with what we call a sprint retrospective, which is where we're just taking time as a team to say, hey, what is working well for us, what's not working well for us, how can we improve, let's make a commitment and take action on that in the next sprint. Yeah. So it's just this very iterative, simple framework that's having a group of people move towards a common goal and then do it again and then do it again. And so, like I said, it can look different ways, but just, it's like upholding empiricism so that we always have transparency to the progress we've made. And there might be times when you're like, actually, we didn't meet our sprint goal. It was a total failure. But now we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about how do we need to work differently to not just keep coming to a committee meeting every month and not actually making any progress and just talking about the thing and not really getting into an experiment. So I think there's a lot of benefit in like the discipline of like, it's not hard, like it's lightweight, but there's a discipline to doing it. And having like, we would look at the person we call the Scrum Master in that situation as like helping to facilitate the process and like make sure that do we have transparency? Like what are we missing? Like what information do we not have? Are we having healthy conversations? Like are we surfacing our conflict? Right? Does everybody feel like they're heard, right? Are we looking at multiple perspectives for real, or are the minority perspectives being ignored, right? Or like whatever those things might be. So what I love about Scrum is like it brings the process, but also the team dynamics and the human side of it together with the value conversation, right? So it's like process, value, team dynamics.
I was thinking how, because like I'm like literally picturing like, oh yeah, like, what would my office look like what would my office look like if we had a more Scrum-esque approach? Like if we were sort of actively like, here's what we're working on. I've seen versions of this, like often say in a hospital setting, it's like, here's our goal, a little bit like that, but I'm picturing it for mine. And I can picture some of the say I like took this to my clinic, like some of the human objections to shifting. Oh, am I frozen now?
Nope.
Oh, good. Okay,
not for me.
Excellent. So I mean, the first one is like the overwhelm of like we're already so busy, things are already so hard. Like there's like I'm curious if some of these arguments you've come across when people are thinking about implementing and shifting the culture towards being more like agile based. Like I'm imagining, is it always or often like I'm too busy to consider, it's too overwhelming and too complex to consider changing our approach. I don't have the time and energy for this.
100%. I hear all of that and more. Like, you know, human brains work the same way, right? Like, like across all industries. But no, like I'll hear a lot of times people are like, oh my God, there's so many meetings in Scrum. And it's like the point of the events in Scrum, they should eliminate the need for other meetings that aren't very useful. And so like, that's one of the things, like I also always ask people, I'm like, why don't you do the math and tell me how much time Scrum prescribes you to be in a meeting maximum? Because there are like rules around this stuff, because you don't want to be in an event for too long, because then that leads to analysis paralysis. So like the minimal rules that exist for Scrum are really all about like not getting stuck in analysis paralysis and like not wasting time, right? And not getting into things that don't need to be decided yet, right? Like, so there's rules around it for that reason, but I think people don't realize why those rules exist, and then they're not using it as effectively. But yeah, I'm like, so do the math, tell me how much, and they do the math and they're like, okay, it's not that much meetings. And I'm like, and look at your calendar. What are all those other meetings for? And I'm not saying they don't need to be there, but it's like this question of like, what is the purpose of this thing? Is this the best way to do it? Right. And it almost kind of goes back to like that conversation around like how we provide certain services. Yeah. It's like, is this the best format to do it? Yeah. And so like, I'm very holistic in looking at people's situations, and it's like, I don't know. Like you are the expert on your context, and I'm going to ask you questions that like help guide you towards finding what is the more effective way for us to work. Yeah. Another big thing, and you kind of hinted at it, is this idea of like visual work management. So, you know, it's one of the common things for a Scrum team or any kind of Agile team, really, whether they're using Scrum or a different type of approach that leverages empiricism, is to have like a visual work management board. And so part of that is so that we have transparency to like what is happening. And then there's also like this sometimes it makes sense. It's like, you know, instead of just divvying everything up and being like, you do this, you do this, you do this, it's like, can we self-organize around the work, right? Yeah. Like, I just freed up. What's the best use of my time now, right? So to me, it actually gives people a little more autonomy. And of course, there's going to be like ground rules around like what makes sense. Yeah. But also just the idea of visualizing your work is super powerful. Yeah. Because now you actually can see it, and then you can be like, well, this is ridiculous. What are we doing? You know, like whatever the conversation is. But there's other techniques you can use that come from like different movements or different practices. And I call it the Agile umbrella, like everything that is aligned to the values and principles. But looking at things like starting to measure things like, okay, like if we have a board that shows how value flows through our system of different types of work we do, different types of service that provides value, we can start to look for patterns and we can start to say like, wow, this is taking this many days to get from here to here. Yeah. Like that's a problem. Like, let's start looking at like, do we have bottlenecks in the system? You know, like, and how can we start to work smarter to shorten things like our cycle time for how frequently we can deliver the value, or recognize where there's waste in the process or quality issues in the process. And then start to look at those patterns and say, well, what could we do sooner to build quality into our work so that we don't keep having this issue happen?
Yeah. I think the one thing I can imagine, and I also am curious if it's across different industries, is folks that are in healthcare, we've often been really, it's sort of, again, the fear of failure and the fear of the shame that we will feel if we are told metrics, or if we actually look at the system, we then will feel badly that it's going so badly or whatever, right? Like I can picture how I can think of even like colleagues or probably myself at certain points where it's like, don't give me a dashboard, or don't give me visuals of metrics, and also the way that they're used. I can think of organizations who, for example, like I'm picturing an organization where in the emergency room, they like showed the data of how long each emergency room physician took to see patients, and they're all like ranked, and like shockingly that wasn't, it's like, I'm thinking about the psychology part. Yeah. And how you address those pieces where people do internalize and have perfectionism and think that if their work is the quality work that's bad, then that means something bad about them as a person. How do those pieces get woven in when you're the facilitator?
We have all the same problems.
Yeah, I was totally all the same. Yeah.
Yeah, but no, like it's a really good point, because we definitely have misuse of metrics in the software space, because it's just so ingrained. Here's my like theory around it, right? Like if we are going to be measured and judged, right? Like you are successful or not successful based on whatever this measure is, then we as humans are going to say, okay, well, I need to make that measure look good. Yes. Oh, that's not the goal, but I'm being measured on that. Well, now the measure has become the goal, so it doesn't really matter what the goal is anymore. Yeah. And this is, so like that's going to happen, that like whether consciously or subconsciously, like that's going to happen. And it's going to lead to either consciously or maybe unconsciously gaming the measures in whatever ways we can. Also, it leads us to set goals that are things we feel we can control. So things that are more activity based or output based versus customer outcomes. Because here's the thing, if you're setting a customer outcome based goal, you have to know that you 100% cannot control that outcome because it's the customer outcome, right? Yes. Like you can do your best and still not meet it. And so I spent a lot of time talking about this. And there's actually a framework that it's kind of like my go-to tool whenever I'm dealing. This is a common challenge in organizations. I see it everywhere I go. My number one tool, it's called the evidence-based management framework. And yes, it does come from evidence-based medicine. I was inspired by that. Yeah. And it's this idea of it, and again, just a framework, but it's this idea of like helping us use goals and measures in ways that are actually useful versus the ways that get gamed, right? The ways that put us into our fear and our scarcity and our feeling at threat, right? Into our reactivity. Yeah. And so, it takes a lot of work and a lot of like continuing education, continuing to point towards like, remember, like we can't perfectly plan. We can't even know if we've got the right goal.
Yeah.
Right. So so what I like about this framework is it's a very simple way, simple but not easy, right? It can be simple but not easy to continually try to deprogram this like tendency, right, that we've gotten from all the systems we exist in, to feel like it's a measure of our worth. Like, this idea of like not measuring our success by how many waves we catch, right?
Yeah.
Like I talk about that and how that relates to like the corporate world and into the business world. And then you could say pretty much every industry. And so one of the things I repeat all the time is measures are information. They are neither good nor bad. It is information. And if that information, if we let it be information, then it's going to be real, the most real data we can have. It's not going to be gamed. It's not going to be, let's not include that because that doesn't look good, right? It's just information. And then that information guides us as we seek towards goals. And I'm very intentional in using that language of seeking towards goals because the goals can change, right? Like we don't necessarily know that we have the right goal at the start. And we might move towards a goal, make progress towards that goal, and get far enough and get the benefits we need, and something has changed in our environment, and now here's the goal we need to be aiming for, and we need to come up with a new goal. And so this idea of like fixed goals and measures as like a metric we're supposed to hit, it actually removes transparency.
Yes.
It just totally cuts transparency, and it leads to like all sorts of like dysfunctions in organizations as well. With like the human behavior aspect of it all. So, so that's like one of the things I'm like most passionate about in my work right now is like evidence-based management. And sometimes I'll talk about it in the formal language of it, but also it's like you can just have these conversations and people get it, like they can relate to it. Now we have to talk about it a lot over and over, and they often need help from someone like me who's going to come in and be like, tell me more about this goal. Okay, so who gets benefit when this goal is achieved? How will you know that? And like asking questions or like, could we achieve this goal and not actually deliver customer value? And it starts to help people see where they've created goals that are like assumption based and or like it's within their control. So for example, like if I have a goal that's like, we can relate this back. We're going to replace scheduling system A with scheduling system B.
Yes, that's the goal.
Okay. Could we do that and not actually achieve the benefit we were aiming for?
For sure.
100%.
Yeah.
Right. And like, so there's just like, it's just somebody helping people like see those things is really useful, and then helping facilitate a conversation that can get towards, well, what we're really trying to achieve is this. And then getting into like, well, we're not sure what that'll look like. Okay, great. That is fantastic that we don't know what that will look like. It's very good that we're admitting that. And so then you can start to move people down a path of like, well, what might be like what's a hypothesis we have? Like, what are some assumptions? Let's start like throwing stuff out there. And then you can start to examine those assumptions, right? And then that gets you towards identifying like what could be a good first experiment to run then. Now that we're clear on what our assumptions are, what we're trying to learn, what's like within our cost schedule range of like a small, simple experiment that gives us enough information to then make the next decision. Not to then know the full plan and exactly what it looks like, but to then run the next experiment.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay, Stephanie, I could literally talk to you for another 2 hours, and I would just like give specific examples, but I'm recognizing we're actually at time, which is so sad. I just want to name some of my takeaways. I think just the notion that really what can be the most effective approach to change, even to addressing complexity and a changing environment, is tiny experiments. Like I literally say tiny experiments all the time, and it's not my personal thing, but when I started just deciding, okay, this is one tiny experiment, including like I'm going to eat lunch every day, or what, like it can be like just for me as a tiny experiment, like, look, I didn't die, no one like kicked me out of medicine, because like we get so ingrained that we cannot change any of these things that are making us miserable. So the notion that tiny experiments, whether individual or on a team, are the way that we can actually enact change is very validating. And so I'm going to take all validating takeaways from this. I think the other thing is it's also validating here that some of the challenges of like enacting this in a team are not unique to healthcare, that they're true everywhere, and that there are ways to facilitate doing them anyway, you know. So, and it's like I hear it's like asking curious questions and like understanding the needs of that team, and not necessarily having to bring in a very rigid outside framework and force it onto the team, but instead like understanding and adapting to what's possible for the team you have. Those are what I took as takeaways from our conversation that are quite inspiring to me. I actually like have like ideas and things. I'm like, what could I do?
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. And I've noticed from the time we've known each other, just that you use the language of agility naturally, like, you know, like talking about experiments and, well, what if we tried this, or what are we assuming about that? So I've noticed that you already have that kind of natural agile mindset.
Love it. Well, and actually I'll say the other takeaway is the thing that I love, like I heard you give sort of a TED Talk version of it, but like your surfing metaphor is so great. Like I just think it's so powerful, and thinking of what we're up against, if you will, or what we're swimming in as literally the ocean, is also very validating, because it really feels that complex, that vast, that like life-threatening at times, you know, like the ocean is a powerful force. And yet, as humans, we encountered this ocean and we attempt to ride upon it. I don't, but you do, you know, like we could, let's try, and we'll do it one wave at a time. Like, I think it's it's way better than the airplane metaphor. So thank you for sharing it with the audience here. So that's my takeaways. Do you have any sort of final points that you want to share with our audience, which are majority people in healthcare, often people who are personally feeling a bit overwhelmed, burnt out, feeling like recognizing that working in healthcare has dehumanized or disconnected them from their humanity in some respects, and they're looking for a way forward. Like, what takeaways are you hoping that they get from our conversation as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a couple things come to mind. I mean, like as you were talking, like one, I was just like, oh, my heart goes out to because I can understand, like I don't work in that industry, but I can imagine how heavy and hard it would be. And also, like, I do work with people who are in systems that are like, I can't change this.
Yeah.
And so, like, there's kind of two things. Like, to me, it's like, you also have your own personal leadership to lean into. Like, you show up and do the things you need to do to feel good, right? And like, I really want everybody to, like, across every single industry, to be like, I am a human and I deserve to be a human and I am worthy, and that is unconditional. Like, I think that's super important. So I really do think, like, leaning into your own personal leadership work is important, and that is what actually helps you let go to some degree of, like, all of the stress and all of the pressure and all of the overwhelm. And I do think when you start to let go of all that and you start to, like, kind of deprogram yourself from that conditioning that we're, like, here to be consumers and we're here to produce and, like, all of that, then you're actually in a place where you feel like you can see opportunities, right? Like, you can see an opportunity to suggest, like, an experiment to try, or start running just your own experiments in whatever realm that you can. And a lot of times, like, when you start to see little successes, your colleagues might start to notice and be like, well, what's she doing over there? Like, I like what I see, like, tell me more. Right. And so when we work on ourselves and we start to let go of all of the things that have been put upon us, and we start to really get the sense of who we really are and live our best lives, to, you know, iteratively and incrementally. It's not like one day you decide, okay, I'm now living my best life, right? It's like that show up every day, resilience, all of that. But then it's like, you will actually start to influence change. just by how you're showing up, and the fact that you are now able to see the big picture and you're not in this like reactive survival mode. You're more open, you're more curious, you're more like, I wonder, like, I see something, let me just start asking some questions. And you start to realize that you started pointing people towards an outcome instead of an output, and you had an impact right there, right? By like naming something nobody else could see. So just like, those are the small things. Just trust that you're always having an impact. And so like, take care of you first, and then that greater impact will have its ripples.
Oh, I love that. That's so beautiful. I love the image of, yeah, like even asking different questions because you're in a different space, that enacts change. I think people think you got to have the answer and sell it to everybody, and I like avoid those people now. I'm like nervous about those people. I'm like, nobody knows the answer. Why do you think you know the answer? The right questions, I think, are much more interesting and effective.
Yeah,
hey?
Absolutely.
So if people want to find you and learn more from you, where can they find you on the internet?
My website is agilesocks.com. Socks, like what you put on your feet. And I have a newsletter. I blog quite a bit, and my writing is very approachable. I don't think you need to work in software or tech, because like I also believe I have like write about like business agility in life and like leadership in life. And sure, I might drop in a work example here and there. But I really like blending these topics, because to me, like, agility is life. Because like, what is more complex and unpredictable than life? So
Truly.
I like to integrate a lot of different stuff in my work. So yeah, you can sign up for my newsletter there. And, you know, I do teach an evidence-based management class. And that class to me is like super approachable, because it's not like, it's not about Scrum even. Like it's like, how do we use goals and measures and think about running experiments? Like it's that simple. And it's to me, it's like the more like creative and interesting mode of exploration.
That sounds really cool. Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing so much of your time and expertise with the folks that listen. And just thank you for existing and being a person that I get to like be in spaces with and get inspired by. I really appreciate you.
Thank you. Me too.
All right. And everyone listening, thanks for listening again. And I'll talk to you next week. I would love to take this work deeper with you. Visit joanchanmd.com today and discover my growing menu of options for restorative medical education to suit your learning needs. I offer one-on-one coaching, customized workshops, and self-study courses that allow you to connect not only with my work on a deeper level, but also with other healthcare humans just like you. So if you want to start humanizing your work in healthcare to a deeper level and do it in community with others, please visit joanchanmd.com and find those options and what fits you and your life today.